Welcome to the complete 24-hour price log for Bitcoin. We begin our detailed timeline on July 30th, 2025. At 6:25 p.m., the price is logged at $117,685. At 6:45 p.m., a slight increase to $117,698. At 7 p.m., a dip to $117,553. By 7:30 p.m., a minor recovery to $117,616. At 7:45 p.m., climbing to $117,740. At 8 p.m., the price is $117,845. At 8:15 p.m., we cross a threshold to $118,026. At 8:31 p.m., a significant peak is reached at $118,607. Following the peak, at 8:45 p.m., a pullback to $118,413. At 9:16 p.m., the price adjusts to $118,136. At 9:30 p.m., standing at $117,987. At 9:45 p.m., the price is $117,792. At 10 a.m., a further slide to $117,857. At 10:15 p.m., valued at $117,752. At 10:31 p.m., holding at $117,745. At 10:45 p.m., a small uptick to $117,777. And at 11:31 p.m., the price is $117,765. A soft chime indicates the change of day. VO, we now enter July 31st. At the stroke of 12 a.m., Bitcoin is at $117,714. At 12:15 a.m., a drop to $117,389. At 12:30 a.m., the descent continues to $116,718. At 12:45 a.m., we hit the session's low point, $116,148. At 1 a.m., a slight bounce to $116,344. At 1:15 a.m., continuing the recovery to $116,465. At 1:30 a.m., the price is $116,957. At 1:45 a.m., breaking past the next barrier to $117,223. At 2:15 a.m., a minor dip to $117,073. At 2:45 a.m., holding steady at $117,101. At 3:15 a.m., a slight pullback to $116,988. At 3:30 a.m., a rebound to $117,288. At 3:45 a.m., climbing to $117,369. At 4 a.m., the price is $117,315. At 4:15 a.m., moving to $117,402. At 4:30 a.m., logged at $117,441. At 4:46 a.m., the price is $117,521. At 5 a.m., a small adjustment to $117,548. At 5:15 a.m., pushing upwards to $117,668. At 5:30 a.m., the price is $117,829. At 5:45 a.m., continuing to $117,869. At 6:01 a.m., we cross back into the 118,000 range at $118,012. At 6:16 a.m., the price is $118,248. At 6:30 a.m., standing at $118,369. At 7:00 a.m., a minor retrace to $118,247. At 7:15 a.m., holding at $118,241. At 7:30 a.m., valued at $118,030. At 7:46 a.m., now at $118,186. At 8 a.m., the price is $118,173. At 8:30 a.m., climbing to $118,427. At 9:01 a.m., a small gain to $118,430. At 9:15 a.m., now $118,432. At 10:01 a.m., a slight dip to $118,380. At 10:15 a.m., recovering to $118,481. At 10:30 a.m., reaching $118,517. At 11 a.m., the price is $118,372. At 11:46 a.m., logged at $118,300. At 12 p.m., now at $118,376. At 12:31 p.m., a strong push to $118,668. At 12:46 p.m., continuing to $118,686. At 1:01 p.m., we record the 24-hour high point, $118,830. At 1:15 p.m., a slight cool down to $118,666. At 2 p.m., the price is $118,619. At 2:30 p.m., holding at $118,629. At 3:01 p.m., a drop to $118,486. At 3:30 p.m., a bounce back to $118,599. At 3:45 p.m., settling at $118,557. At 4:15 p.m., the price is $118,468. At 4:30 p.m., a slight gain to $118,502. At 5:30 p.m., valued at $118,321. At 5:45 p.m., now at $118,387. And our final entry, concluding the 24-hour cycle at 6:15 p.m., the price of Bitcoin stands at $118,381.